Imagine stepping onto a battlefield where the very ground shakes beneath your feet, where clouds of poison drift across the trenches, and where a single machine gun can cut down hundreds in minutes. This was not the war of knights and cavalry charges, not the war of gallantry or noble duels. This was a new kind of war. A war defined not by bravery alone, but by the machinery of death. World War I was the moment when technology and industry collided with the battlefield, and humanity would never be the same again. Welcome to our deep dive into the terrifying technology of the Great War. The tanks that rolled across no man's land, the poison gas that choked the lungs of soldiers, the machine guns that turned attacks into massacres, and the countless innovations, from artillery to airplanes, from flamethrowers to barbed wire, that transformed the face of warfare forever. If you think you know war, think again. This is the story of how World War I created the modern battlefield. The industrial age meets the battlefield. When the First World War erupted in 1914, most nations believed it would be over quickly, home by Christmas, as the saying went. But the world was marching into a conflict unlike any it had ever seen. The nations of Europe were not just armed with rifles and cavalry. They were armed with the full force of the Industrial Revolution. Factories that once produced cars, trains, and steel now churned out weapons on a scale unimaginable in earlier wars. The result was a battlefield dominated not by individual heroism, but by mass production, guns, shells, wire, and machines designed to kill on an industrial level. The generals of 1914 were still clinging to 19th century tactics. Brightly uniformed infantry charging across open fields, cavalry mounted on horseback, bayonets gleaming in the sun. But these old strategies would collapse when they collided with new technologies. Within weeks, the war had bogged down into trenches stretching hundreds of miles. And in those trenches, soldiers would face the full horror of modern science turned against them. The machine gun, the grim reaper of the trenches. If one weapon symbolized the nightmare of trench warfare, it was the machine gun. Invented in the late 19th century, perfected by the time of World War I, the machine gun was capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute. The British Vickers, the German MG08, the French Hotchkiss, each one could unleash a storm of bullets that made traditional infantry charges suicidal. On paper, the machine gun was just a weapon. In reality, it was a wall of death. When soldiers went over the top, climbing out of their trenches and charging across no man's land, they were met not with scattered rifle fire, but with relentless streams of bullets cutting them down in swaths. The Battle of the Somme in 1916 offers one of the most chilling examples. On the first day alone, British soldiers advanced into the teeth of German machine guns. By nightfall, nearly 60,000 men were dead or wounded, the single bloodiest day in British military history. Entire units were erased in minutes, shredded by a weapon that required only a few men to operate. The machine gun turned offense into suicide and defense into slaughter. It froze armies into their trenches and forced generals to rethink how wars could even be fought. Barbed wire and the fortress of the trenches. The machine guns did not stand alone. They were part of a system of defense that made the Western Front a fortress of misery. Barbed wire, originally a tool for fencing livestock in America, became a weapon of war. Miles of it were strung in front of trenches, coiled in thick rolls, designed to slow down or trap attacking soldiers. Under machine gun fire, barbed wire was a death trap. Soldiers caught in its sharp steel coils were mowed down before they could cut themselves free. Cutting parties would crawl out at night with wire cutters, risking their lives to clear a path for the next assault. Often, they failed, and waves of men found themselves funneled directly into the killing zones of enemy fire. The trench system, reinforced with wire and protected by machine guns, created the infamous stalemate of World War I. A fence was nearly impossible. defense was brutally effective. And into this deadlock, new weapons would be unleashed. Weapons that pushed the limits of human imagination and human suffering. The artillery barrage, the thunder of modern war. Above all else, World War I was an artillery war. Cannons had existed for centuries, but never before on this scale. The great powers brought their biggest guns to the battlefield, and the results were catastrophic. Artillery accounted for the majority of deaths in World War I, not the rifle, not even the machine gun, but the thunderous barrage of shells raining down day and night. Heavy howitzers, massive mortar, and long-range railway guns pounded trenches, flattening forests, and turning towns into rubble. The Battle of Verdun in 1916, for example, became a duel of artillery more than anything else. Over 60 million shells were fired in 10 months, a storm of steel that obliterated the landscape, creating craters so vast that they still scar the land today. Soldiers lived under constant bombardment, the ground shaking, the air filled with shrieking shells and choking dust. Many men were buried alive in collapsing trenches. Others were driven mad by the endless thunder, a condition known as shell shock. Artillery was supposed to break the deadlock, to smash defenses and clear a path for infantry. But often, it only deepened the stalemate. Barbed wire remained intact. Machine guns survived in dugouts, and soldiers advancing into no man's land found themselves crossing fields already churned into killing grounds. It was into this world of trenches, wire, guns, and shells that even darker technologies would emerge. Poison gas, death in the air. On April 22, 1915, near the Belgian town of Ypres, German forces unleashed a weapon that stunned the world. As the wind shifted, greenish-yellow clouds drifted across no man's land. The French and Algerian soldiers defending the line suddenly clutched their throats, coughing, gasping, eyes burning. It was chlorine gas, the first large-scale use of chemical weapons in history. Panic spread. Soldiers fled, choking and blinded. Entire sections of the line collapsed under the invisible assault. Poison gas had entered the arsenal of modern war. Over the course of the war, gas evolved. Chlorine, phosgene, and the most feared of all, mustard gas. Unlike chlorine, mustard gas did not kill quickly. It blistered skin, burned eyes, and corroded lungs. Victims writhed in agony, often for days. Even survivors were left scarred, blinded, or permanently disabled. Gas masks soon became a soldier's most vital piece of equipment. Early versions were crude, rags soaked in urine meant to neutralize chlorine, but eventually proper respirators were developed. Still, gas was a constant terror. A shifting wind could send it back over your own trenches. Shells filled with poison could be fired anywhere, anytime, without warning. Though chemical weapons caused fewer deaths than artillery or bullets, their psychological impact was enormous. Gas was the silent, unseen killer, a horror that haunted soldiers long after the war ended. The search for a breakthrough? By 1916, the Western Front was locked in a nightmare cycle. Machine guns, barbed wire, and trenches made offense nearly impossible. Artillery and poison gas made defense unbearable. Millions of men were trapped in this deadly stalemate. The question was simple. How do you break through? How do you cross no man's land, smash the wire, silence the guns, and end the slaughter? The answer would come in the form of one of the most iconic inventions of the 20th century. A weapon that looked like a steel monster crawling across the battlefield. A weapon that promised mobility, protection, and firepower. The birth of the tank. The idea of an armored, mobile fortress was not new. Military thinkers had dreamed of something like it for centuries. But it took the brutality of the First World War to turn that dream into reality. Britain, desperate to find a way to cross no man's land, began experimenting with armored vehicles in 1915. The code name for the project was water tanks, to disguise their true purpose. and from that cover name, the word tank was born. By 1916, the first tanks were ready for battle. They were slow, lumbering beasts, weighing more than 25 tons, crawling along at just 3 miles per hour. Their armor could shrug off small arms fire, and their tracks allowed them to crush barbed wire and crawl over trenches. Inside, conditions were nightmarish, cramped, sweltering, filled with choking fumes from the engine. Crews endured heat, noise, and the constant fear of being trapped inside if the machine was hit. The first major tank attack came at the Battle of the Somme in September 1916. British tanks rumbled forward across no man's land, terrifying German defenders who had never seen anything like them. But the early models were unreliable. Many broke down before reaching the battlefield. Others became stuck in shell craters or were knocked out by artillery. Still, the potential was clear. Here was a weapon that could cross the killing fields of the Western Front. By 1917 and 1918, tanks had improved. The British Mark IV and the French Renault FT became symbols of armored warfare. The Renault FT, with its rotating turret, set the pattern for tanks that would dominate the 20th century. At the Battle of Cambrai in 1917, hundreds of British tanks attacked together, smashing through German lines and proving that this new invention could finally overcome the stalemate. For the first time in history, the battlefield had seen armored vehicles rolling forward under machine gun and artillery fire, a glimpse of the wars to come. The flamethrower, fire on the battlefield. While tanks were meant to inspire fear through size and power, another weapon terrified soldiers in a far more primal way: fire. The German army introduced the flamethrower in 1915, a weapon that projected streams of burning liquid up to 30 yards. Flamethrowers were devastating in trench assaults. A sudden blast of fire would clear bunkers and dugouts, forcing defenders to flee or burn. The psychological effect was enormous. Few things inspired such raw terror as the sight of flames rushing toward you. But flamethrowers had their limitations. Operators carried heavy fuel tanks on their backs, making them vulnerable targets. If a bullet struck the tank, the result could be fatal. Flamethrower teams often suffered high casualties, but their weapon left a lasting impression. Fire had returned to the battlefield in a form both ancient and terrifyingly modern. The war in the skies, from observation to combat. When World War I began, airplanes were barely a decade old. At first, they were used only for reconnaissance, scouting enemy positions, photographing trenches, spotting for artillery. But it didn't take long before rival pilots began shooting at each other. Soon, the skies above Europe became a new kind of battlefield. Machine guns were mounted on planes, and the dogfight was born. German engineer Anthony Fokker developed a synchronization gear that allowed machine guns to fire through a spinning propeller without striking the blades, giving German pilots a deadly advantage. For a time in 1915, the Fokker scourge dominated the skies. But other nations quickly caught up, and soon the air war became a contest of innovation. Aces like Germany's Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, and America's Eddie Rickenbacker became legends, dueling in fragile machines made of wood and fabric. While air combat captured the public imagination, the real strategic impact of airplanes came from reconnaissance and bombing. By 1917, both sides were using planes to drop bombs on enemy trenches, supply lines, and even cities. Air raids on London and Paris brought the war home to civilians, showing for the first time that the skies themselves could be a battlefield. Though primitive compared to World War II aircraft, the planes of the Great War were the pioneers of modern air power, a technology that would change not just warfare, but the entire 20th century. Subterranean warfare, mines and explosions below the earth. Not all of World War I's technological horrors came from above. Some came from beneath the ground. Along the Western Front, Both sides dug tunnels under enemy positions, filling them with explosives. When detonated, these mines created massive craters, obliterating trenches and burying defenders alive. One of the largest such explosions occurred in June 1917 during the Battle of Messines. British engineers placed nearly 1 million pounds of explosives beneath German lines. When they were detonated, the earth shook for miles. The blast was so massive that it was reportedly heard in London, more than 140 miles away. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were killed instantly, and the landscape was reshaped in a single moment. Subterranean warfare was grueling, claustrophobic, and deadly. Miners dug in silence to avoid detection, fearing enemy countermines that could collapse tunnels and entomb them alive. It was another reminder that World War I left no part of the earth untouched, from the skies above to the soil beneath. The deadly marriage of old and new. What made World War I particularly horrifying was not just the new weapons themselves, but the way they combined with older traditions of warfare. Cavalry charges, once the pride of armies, met machine guns and were cut down in minutes. Soldiers advancing in long lines, as in the Napoleonic era, were shredded by artillery and wire. This clash of the old and the new created some of the bloodiest battles in history. Generals struggled to adapt. Do you throw men against machine guns in hopes of overwhelming them? Do you trust in massive artillery barrages, even though the enemy often survives underground? Or do you gamble on untested machines like tanks and planes? There were no easy answers. And so the war dragged on, fueled by an arms race of innovation. Each new weapon inspired a countermeasure. Gas masks followed poison gas. Armor followed machine guns. Anti-aircraft guns followed airplanes. Technology was advancing faster than strategy, and soldiers paid the price. America enters the war, and technology evolves again. For the first 3 years of the war, the United States remained neutral, watching as Europe tore itself apart. But by 1917, German unrestricted submarine warfare and the infamous Zimmermann telegram pushed America into the conflict. When American troops arrived in France, they stepped into a world of technology they had never seen before. American soldiers, or doughboys, encountered machine guns, poison gas, and tanks for the first time. They trained to use gas masks, learned to navigate barbed wire, and faced artillery barrages that shook the very earth. The U.S. quickly adopted modern technologies, producing machine guns like the Browning M1917 and contributing to tank development alongside Britain and France. America also brought fresh manpower and industrial strength, ensuring that the tide of technology could now be fully mobilized against Germany. In battles like Cantigny, Belleauwood, and the Meuse-Argonne offensive, American forces fought with a mix of old determination and new weapons, proving that they could stand in the modern battlefield alongside their allies. By 1918, the combination of tanks, coordinated artillery, aircraft, and fresh American troops began to break the deadlock. The final offensives of the war showed glimpses of a new kind of combined arms warfare, one that would dominate the next century. The climax of innovation minus 1918 and the final push. By 1918, the Western Front had been locked in a stalemate for nearly 4 years. Millions were dead, the land was scarred beyond recognition, and the armies were exhausted. Yet the technology of war was about to reach its peak. The Germans, desperate to win before American power could fully tip the scales, launched the Spring Offensive in March 1918. They used stormtrooper tactics, small, fast-moving infantry groups armed with grenades, light machine guns, and flamethrowers to infiltrate enemy lines rather than overwhelm them with sheer numbers. Backed by devastating artillery barrages, these tactics allowed German forces to punch deep into Allied positions. But the Allies responded with their own blend of technology and manpower. For the first time, tanks, aircraft, artillery, and infantry were coordinated in large-scale assaults. At the Battle of Amiens in August 1918, more than 400 tanks spearheaded the Allied attack. Aircraft swooped overhead, strafing and bombing German positions. Artillery provided rolling barrages that moved forward with the troops. It was a glimpse of modern combined arms warfare, and it shattered German morale. From that moment, the tide could not be turned back. German defenses collapsed. Technology, industry, and American reinforcements had finally broken the stalemate. The human cost of modern war. While the machines of war grew ever more advanced, the human body remained tragically vulnerable. Soldiers endured unimaginable conditions in the trenches: mud, rats, disease, constant shelling, and the fear of gas attacks. Every innovation seemed designed to find a new way to kill or maim. Artillery shattered bones. Gas scarred lungs. Machine guns tore flesh. Flamethrowers left men burned beyond recognition. And even those who survived often carried invisible wounds. Shell shock, what we would now call PTSD, haunted countless veterans, their minds broken by the endless bombardment and the trauma of mechanized slaughter. The Great War killed more than 16 million people and wounded 20 million more. An entire generation was scarred, both physically and emotionally. And much of that suffering was driven not by strategy or politics, but by technology, by the relentless march of industrial science into the heart of the battlefield. The end of the war and the legacy of technology. On November 11, 1918, the guns finally fell silent. The armistice ended the fighting, but the world could never return to what it had been before. The war had proven that technology, once unleashed, could transform the battlefield into a machine of mass destruction. Tanks had shown that armored vehicles could dominate land battles. Poison gas had revealed the terrifying potential of chemical warfare. Machine guns had proven that a handful of men could slaughter thousands. Airplanes, artillery, flamethrowers, and barbed wire had each left their mark. The legacy of World War I's technology did not end in 1918. In fact, it was only the beginning. Tanks would evolve into the armored divisions of World War II. Aircraft would become bombers and fighters that decided wars from the sky. Chemical weapons would return in later conflicts, banned and yet always feared. Machine guns would remain the backbone of infantry warfare. The First World War was supposed to be the war to end all wars. Instead, it became the laboratory for the wars that followed. Humanity had unlocked the tools of industrialized killing, and the 20th century would prove just how devastating those tools could be. Reflections, technology, and humanity. Looking back, it is easy to see World War I as a clash of machines, but at its heart, it was still a war fought by people. Men built the machines, men carried them into battle, and men suffered their consequences. The soldiers in the trenches were not just statistics. They were sons, brothers, fathers, caught in a storm of technology they could not control. The weapons of the Great War were not evil in themselves. They were inventions, born of human ingenuity. But in the crucible of war, that ingenuity was turned toward destruction. And the lesson of World War I is not just about the power of machines, but about the choices humanity makes in how we use them. And so, as the smoke cleared in 1918, the world stood on the edge of a new era. Tanks, gas, and machine guns had forever changed the battlefield. War would never again be the same. If this story moved you, if you could almost hear the rattle of machine guns or feel the tremor of tanks rolling across no man, then join us as we continue uncovering the hidden stories of history. Because the past isn't just about dates and battles. It's about the choices, the mistakes, and the innovations that shape the world we live in today. Don't forget to like this video. If you learned something new, drop a comment with your thoughts about the most shocking weapon of world. War Eye, and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter in this journey through history. Together, we'll keep the memory alive and make sure the lessons of the past are never forgotten.